What's up, everybody? The wait is finally over and totally over. Left at Wall is available now, right now. You can get Left at Wall on Apple TV, Google Play, YouTube Movies. You can get it on demand. You can buy it on DVD. The wait is totally over. Just type in Left at Wall on your search bar on your smart TV, and you can find a bunch of ways to get it. You can watch it now. Again, that's Left at Wall, wherever you get your movies. Episode 76, Eleanor Goldfield. Eleanor Goldfield is a journalist, filmmaker, and more than anything, she's a creative radical. Also, I hope she doesn't mind my saying so, she put out some killer music a few years back. I've been following her for years now and figured now was a perfect time for us to dive into the world. Please welcome to the show, Eleanor Goldfield. Eleanor Goldfield, how are you? Good to see you again.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So I want to start at the beginning. First of all, where did you grow up? Like where are you from?
Oh, that's a tricky question. I could be poetic and say I grew up in Los Angeles because I moved there at 18 and thought I knew a bunch of things that I didn't. But if we're talking about specifically chronologically, I grew up between Charlotte, North Carolina and Sweden.
Mm-hmm. So how did that happen? Like, did you have
for why?
Yeah. Like, what was it? Like, was one parent Swedish and the other wasn't, or how does?
Yes. And she still is Swedish. So my dad is, I guess you could say American. He's first generation Russian Jewish immigrant. Like as in first generation, he grew up in Brooklyn. Cliche, I know. But, and my mom came to the US, I think in like 1981. And so I like to say I'm the child of immigrants, but the white supremacists never like it when I point that out. And so it was basically like my dad works at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte as a history professor, and my mom is an artist. And I grew up in between the two places and, have a lot of frequent flyer miles, which is nice, but it was weird, but it was, I feel very privileged to have grown up in this way.
As a kid, which place did you prefer?
I preferred wherever I wasn't.
Okay.
I was very much like a grass. I think kids are, because you always feel like I always felt like I was missing out on something, when I was in Sweden, I felt like I was missing out on stuff in the US and vice versa. As I got older, I started to appreciate how much easier life was in Sweden. Even just in terms of being able to walk to the store by myself, no one was afraid that I was going to be abducted. I felt a lot more freedom as a kid in Sweden. But that being said, I certainly wouldn't say that my upbringing in Charlotte was bad in any way. It was just, I'd say it was your average upbringing in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is kind of a shithole city, unfortunately. A lot of beautiful people, but not a great town.
I've had some fun times in Charlotte. I know it's kind of a banking town. But one of my favorite record stores in the country is in Charlotte.
When did it open?
Well, I don't know exactly when it's open. It's called Lunchbox Records, and it's run by this kind of older British punk. I forget his name because it's been years for me, but that was always one of my favorite record stores. And admittedly, I don't know if it's even still there because this is, my last trip was almost a decade ago. But it's always been one of my favorites. I was actually briefly in Charlotte recently because I have some family in the Southeast. We had a death not too terribly long ago. So, thanks. But yeah, so we flew into Charlotte, but it was a very brief, just kind of get in the rental car.
Charlotte has a great airport. It's actually the best part about Charlotte is the getting out of there via the airport. And I say this, I used to have an issue with my roots there, but I have a lot of love for the Southeast. I have a lot of love for the people there, the radical history that is the South, that is continuously misrepresented and sort of flattened and made flimsy by by the propaganda machine. I have a lot of love in particular for Appalachia. I used to escape a lot to Western North Carolina, particularly Asheville, because it was, at least at the time before it started getting really gentrified, it was proper weird. And I felt like I wasn't alone in the world. But so the disdain that I have for Charlotte in particular has nothing to do with the fact that it's specifically in the Southeast. It's just the Charlotte aspect. So just to clarify. No,
I totally understand. And I think you put it very, very well. I share those sentiments in particular about the Southeast. And, I mean, I lived in Nashville for a few years, although it could be debated whether that's technically the Southeast or still the Midwest. But either way, it's definitely Appalachia. And, like I'm from Pittsburgh originally. So yeah, I have I share pretty much all those sentiments, but everybody has a little bit of a grudge with their hometown. Like I think it's impossible not to. Like, how could you not?
That's true. I think that, I mean, I know some people who don't, but like people who grew up in Stockholm or something, but just because it's like such a perfect place, for kids. But, yeah, I think you always have that push and pull, especially when you leave and come back and you realize that you can't come back. And yeah, a lot of the human experience.
So when you were a kid, going back and forth between those two places, and you're saying there were some differences, being able to walk to the store by yourself and stuff like that, how was that explained to you? Like by the adults in your life? Like, how did they make you understand, hey, there's more danger here than the other place? Like, did you understand why? Did you have questions?
So my parents were always really honest with me. And my father is a historian who specializes in Southern history from about the time of the Civil War through civil rights. So he never sugarcoated anything and got very frustrated when people did. And used to say that, history is there to make us uncomfortable. So he was always very honest about things, even when the KKK came after him for being this Northern kike who was writing about them, and they didn't like that and things like that. So he was always honest.
Was that their official press release?
Yeah.
I mean, that sounds like something they would put out.
Yeah. And I mean, they did not. The Sons of Confederacy would come and try to ruin his book release events and stuff at Borders. Yeah, it was a whole thing. But so I grew up understanding. I was pretty politicized, although I wouldn't have used that language, obviously, at the time, from a pretty early age, because I had this understanding of the differences and why there were differences. My family would always talk politics, including my Swedish family in Sweden. And so I grew up around that dinner table, understanding the problems with the Swedish government and how that compared to the problems with the U.S. government. So I grew up in that environment, and people never tried to lie to me and make it something that it wasn't. So I can't remember ever having that Santa Claus moment where I was like, wait, it's not that. I think I just, from the beginning of understanding these things, I understood it for what it was.
So as far as what politicized you or what radicalized you, it was sort of just, that's how it was displayed to you.
Yeah. I oftentimes ask people who grew up in very sheltered or very cocooned households, how did you see the Matrix? I feel like I grew up hanging out with Neo. That was kind of my, I grew up understanding it from the outset. And so I feel like for someone like me, it would be unacceptable if I didn't choose the path that I chose, or that chose me, however you want to phrase that. Because I was always aware of the sort of facade, whether that be of American exceptionalism or of even Swedish exceptionalism, whatever. I always understood the difference between the propaganda and the lived realities. And so I think in terms of what radicalized me is I started, I guess what the difference is that I started thinking in these kind of silos. I came out very heavily against the Second Iraq War when I was 15, 16 in 2002, and knew at the time that it had nothing to do with 9/11, and all of that. And so I after a while, I started to realize that, okay, this issue is not actually disconnected from environmental issues, which is kind of how I started. I started by being an environmental activist years before that. And I was like, oh shit, these are connected. And yeah, I can't like pull on one thread over here without it pulling something over here. And so that's when I started to have this larger perspective on capitalism and colonialism and imperialism. But I'd say that I always understood things relatively, but I understood them more in silos as opposed to interconnected in this American project, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's so interesting you bring up the Iraq War because I actually, you and I are of the same era, and I heard someone the other day describe us as sort of the Iraq War generation, which makes so much sense. And I know for me, I came to it a little later, but when it was first going on, I had not seen The Matrix, and I kind of thought, this doesn't sound right, but I guess the president knows something I don't, right? We're not the bad guys. So. You would think so. And then within about a year, especially when I went away to college, then all of a sudden it was, oh man, the training wheels were off. And, I was awake and I have not looked back since. So I think for a lot of people that maybe didn't grow up with something at that level that you did, there is usually some kind of event that just sort of, pushes you into, into this, like basically pushes you out of Wonderland and into reality. And you're just, oh boy, this is something. Yeah. Well, so you do a lot of different creative things, from music to journalism to filmmaker. How would you describe yourself? How would you describe what you do?
I usually say that I'm a creative radical and a journalist and a filmmaker. Creative radical just because it's kind of an umbrella term. And I used to say creative activist, but I stopped using that word.
Why?
And radical because I'm a word nerd, and the root of radical is actually the roots, which I find that just really lovely. So that's why I phrase that in that way, because my goal and my attempts are all at striking at the roots of the issue, not dealing with surface facade concepts. And so that's really how I would term it. I dabble in a lot of different things. I like to say that I get bored easily, so that's why I do a bunch of different mediums. And sometimes I fall backwards into them, like I fell backwards into the filmmaking thing because I had a TV show with Free Speech TV for 5 years, and I had headed down to West Virginia to get footage for a story, and then I realized I had so much footage, and sitting and hanging out with a friend, and I was like, I don't know what to do with all this footage. I have all this footage, and she's like, some people call that like film footage. And I was like, okay, let's do this. I mean, it was I feel like filmmakers, if there are any watching this, are like, oh God, that's awful. But I'm sorry. I didn't go to film school or anything. But yeah, so it just kind of, I fell into it because I felt that I couldn't do right by the people who shared their stories with me unless I did a proper film. And so it being my primary thing to make sure that I did right by the people whose stories I tell, because as somebody who's been an organizer for a long time, one of my main pet peeves is people who just come in for a headline and just leave without really getting a proper story. It's very extractive. They don't really care if they get it right. They misquote. They don't stay in touch. They don't care actually how it ends up working out for you. I don't want to be that person. And so, it always has felt really important to me that I make sure that I do right by the people who share their stories with me. And so that's how I fell into filmmaking. And, I think a lot of my endeavors have kind of worked out that way. I follow what I kind of feel in the moment, whether that be poetry or music or, what have you.
Why did you drop the activist label?
I dropped it because it started to, I felt, get co-opted like so many other things do, by not just the Democratic Party, but the kind of neoliberal machine, like, oh, we're activists against Trump, or we're activists, whatever the case may be. And really what that means to them is that you complain and you kvetch about it a lot, but you don't actually do anything. You don't act, you might go to some parade where you wear this pink hat on your head. But that doesn't affect anything. It doesn't change the power structures. And I'm not a big fan of parades at all. I mean, well, permitted marches, but this kind of idea that being an activist just means that you complain about things. And I think that is also, going back to kind of the Southeast, this is also a very genuine perception that a lot of folks have in places that are treated like foregone conclusions for the right, but are really just places that are tired of being trampled on and need predominantly poor white areas is what I'm familiar with and what I'm talking about. But they have these genuine complaints and concerns, and they say, like, if you're just here to complain that I exist and that I don't like the Democrats, that's not good enough. What do you want? You want me to quit my job at the coal mine and then do what? Watch my kids starve? Like, this kind of activism where it's just like complaining about these issues, but not really looking at just transition, not looking at solutions, and not looking at the two-party system as really a one-party entity. So I dropped that because I didn't like that I had to explain to people, but I'm not like them. So I just decided I'm going to make it sound a little edgier, not because I want to scare people, but because I want them to ask the question, like, what does that mean? What does the radical mean? And have that be the question, as opposed to, oh, you're just this kind of armchair activist who likes to complain about things.
So getting into some of your work, I already know this because you told me in the past, but you're the first person that I heard this from, and I love the way you frame it. So if you would give the story again, what is the truth behind the term redneck? Where does it really come from? Mm-hmm. What's the misconception there?
Yeah. So the term redneck actually stems from the mine wars, which happened in southwestern West Virginia and Kentucky in at the turn of the century. And basically what happened was that, I mean, there's a lot of backstory here, but basically coal miners at the time were not paid in money, like actual money that you could use elsewhere. They were paid in like company money that you could use at the company store. That's why the line, I sold my soul to the company store. You could only go to places that were owned by the company that you worked for. So you couldn't actually leave. And this was basically a way to ensure that people could never leave their situation because they had no money to start over or to move. So it was a way to lock people into these awful conditions where they weren't paid enough. Their living conditions were absolutely abhorrent. And the other thing that they did was it was very like a very pointed type of propagandization. So and they would go like to Ellis Island and get immigrants right off the boat, and they would bring them down, promise them the world, the American dream, and they would keep them. So they'd keep like the Eastern European Jews over here and the Italians over here, and then they'd keep Black folks over here, and then they'd keep Irish over here or whatever. And they would talk shit. They would tell them, "Oh, you don't want to mess with the Jews because they eat babies, and the Black people they're just savages, and they don't wear clothes or whatever." Like all of this horrific propaganda to try and ensure that these people never talked, never connected. And so against all of these odds, coal miners across this region banded together. They started talking through language barriers, through cultural barriers. They started connecting and realizing that they are all in the same shit, and that the enemy is not actually each other, but it's the coal barons that are perpetuating this kind of oppression, these kind of living conditions that are, subpar would be putting it nicely. And what they did, they didn't petition. I mean, they might have to start with, like, hey, would you mind paying us more? And this is the reason why this is not taught in schools. They got guns and they marched with red bandanas so that they could identify each other. This was not a permitted march. They tied on red bandanas so they could identify who was on their side and who the who were the people that were brought in to work the mines when they were decided not to work and things like that. And they went and they shot at coal barons. And they won, I'm abridging this a lot, they won basic workers' rights. They were paid in U.S. money. Children were no longer sent into the mines. Children as young as 4. One of the guys that I spoke to in my documentary, his grandfather started working in the mines when he was 4. I have a 3-year-old. That the idea of that is so remarkably grotesque. And these children were oftentimes put in really confined spaces that other people couldn't get to. They were often treated as the canary in the coal mine. So these are some basic things that the workers were asking for that anybody with like half a brain would be like, yeah, absolutely. And they had to fight for it. And when I say fight, I actually mean that. I don't mean signing petitions, and I don't mean voting for this dude over that other dude. I mean, they actually fought, and they weren't hanged. Black and white workers, immigrant and, local born, marched together, fought together, and they won some basic rights. And this is the story of the mine wars. This is where the term redneck comes from. The term redneck is actually a radical, and I'd say leftist, even though I think it's important to point out that nobody there was saying that we're communists or we're social. Like, that's not what it was about. They were just basically saying we deserve human rights. It's just that so happens to be like the leftist perspective these days.
Especially here.
Yeah. So basically the term redneck is actually a really radical, progressive, if you want to use that term that has been bastardized and contorted through the purposeful burying of history to become something for the totally other side of the perspective. People call Trump a redneck, and I'm like, oh, wow, that's just the dumbest. Oh, God. Also, yeah, okay. But so that's the very brief, abridged history of that term. And there's some beautiful people doing really grassroots radical work down there, which is really digging up that history and ensuring that people learn that so they know not only, hey, you're descended from this radicalness, but also this is a thing we can do again. We can decide to put aside differences that are really like either skin deep or, a little bit deeper. We can put aside the differences that we have on other issues and really focus in on what do we need to survive, to thrive, even because we deserve that. And so I think that's why I feel very strongly about teaching history radically, because it's really important to recognize what was buried and why it was buried.
So, and just before we get off the topic, give the name of that documentary for anyone who might not know.
It's called Hard Road of Hope, and you can find it at hardroadofhope.com. I've been doing I released it in 2020. The pandemic made time just totally immaterial, but I believe it was 2020, and
right.
I've been doing screenings, so if folks are interested in any kind of screenings or anything like that, those have been ongoing. And yeah.
Do you have, if you had to just pick one medium, could you do it?
Is this like asking me to choose between wine and chocolate? Because I think I might just
a little bit. I mean, just hypothetically, in a hypothetical.
It depends on the day,
Uh-huh.
I think I would have to hold on to writing, and I know that I'm stretching that because that goes across several mediums, so I'm kind of stepping outside of your your question.
No, I'll allow it. No, that.
But it's very difficult because, especially with music, I've felt very much like an absentee partner recently. But I think I can't let go of words, even though I realize how absurd words fail in so many instances. And I realize that English is kind of a sad language a lot of times. It lacks a lot of descriptors. But yeah, I think the writing.
No, I mean, that's just always an interesting question for me to ask, especially since I too... the way I like to frame it is there's a variety is the spice of life creators. And I feel like I'm one of those too. Like if I'm only focused on stand up, I get some weird FOMO and I feel not great about it. If I'm not focused on stand up enough, I get a little grumpy because I miss it a bunch. If I'm not producing anything, I miss that headache, actually. And so I'm kind of like, and I like doing podcasting stuff, but I wouldn't want it to be my only thing. And when I was too engulfed in it, I was actually really not happy because there was just too much. So I'm a variety of the spice of life is the spice of life creator too, or I just can't be happy. I'm not sure. It
maybe it's that.
It could be a little bit of both, but but so I'm always intrigued, and my answer is actually the same as yours. If I could only do one, I would just pick writing. Because at the end of the day, I think that's the root of everything.
Yes,
at least everything I do.
Yeah, absolutely, it is.
So, has becoming a mom changed your perspective at all?
Oh my God, yeah.
In what
I think
way?
if you ever ask anyone that and they say no, they're lying or they're medicated, which is totally fair. The becoming a parent stretches the spectrum of human experience in both directions. Like you will feel bliss that you never felt, and you will feel like such despair that you're like, this might actually break me in ways that I didn't think possible. And anxiety and fear and all of that. But it's definitely changed my perspective. And I think one of the primary ways that it does is it challenges you to stick by your beliefs. So being anti-authoritarian with a toddler, believing in autonomy and believing that, hierarchies that are, perpetuated through force are bad, that is tested daily. And you realize that kids are born kind of like anarchists. They're born, and I don't mean that in like how people think anarchy is chaos. Anarchy just means no rulers. Because they're born with this feeling of like wanting to collaborate, not being forced into anything. They don't want to force you into anything either. It's just this kind of like, why can't we just do this together? And I don't understand why I have to put my shoes on right now. Like, and you're like, because we live in this world and it requires shoes. So and so I think like the challenge of finding a way to parent that is inherently like human and therefore anti-capitalist and like not into the idea of imposing structures of control onto your children. I think it's really hard, but it's also really beautiful because I feel like I have to show up in ways that I didn't have to before. I have to challenge those beliefs and really ask myself, okay, is this really what I believe? Is this really like, does this make sense? Does this feel useful and outside of kind of a mutual aid or a community organizing setting? And the answer is not just yes, but fuck yes. Like it absolutely does. And so my kid, and I know that people will say like, oh, that's so trite. You're saying that your kid taught you things, but no, like really, my kid has taught me a lot about what I view as possible in terms of how we interact with each other as human beings and how we can build something that is for everybody, not just for people who already agree with us or who have already been trained to listen and trained to respect authority and things like that. And what I'd like to pass on, what I'd like to pass on that doesn't include some of the traumas that I carry with me. It's again, it's heavy, but it's also been like a really beautiful experience. And I think I've shown up actually for my community better because of being a parent.
Has it made you more or less hopeful?
Again, it depends on the day.
That's fair.
I mean, I will say organizing with youth has made me really quite hopeful. Of course, I recognize that I'm getting like a selection of the youth. This isn't how all youth are. No section of the world is a monolith. But there are people that are like 16, 17 that have language and an analysis of the world that I certainly did not have at 16 or 17. And I was somebody who had the tools. I had I had been reading, like I said. So I do have a lot of hope in that. I have a lot of hope for a lot of the people who are raising kids right now, raising them to be in the world in a different way than the world is right now. And that's not even just people that are self-selected. I see this just like at people, at daycare who, probably voted for Harris, maybe for Trump. I don't know. But like, they're not as radical as me, but they're still, teaching their kids about consent at an early age and, teaching them about, yes, we're going to read this book about the two dads or whatever. It's like, it's like even people who aren't in these kind of more radical spaces, I think, are raising kids that will do better, in a lot of ways. And so in that sense, I am very hopeful. Now, like I sometimes tell Lee, if we just end up, if the world just gets hit by that asteroid, or if somebody presses the red button because Trump fired the entire nuclear science sector, at least I don't have to pay for college. No.
That's awesome. I actually think that the younger generations, Gen Z, and I actually, who's after them? I'm not even sure what they have.
What I am.
Do they have? Yeah. Well, I know I'm a millennial, but I'm one of like the older ones. I'm like a tail end millennial.
What year are you?
84.
Okay, then I'm a millennial too. I'm 86.
Okay, yeah. We got in right at the cusp. I think like 81 or 82 is the cutoff. So we're like,
who decides this? Who's
There's a guy. There's a guy. He's verified. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. He runs the numbers, and that was like the definitive one. But whatever after Z is, yeah. No, I find them incredibly inspiring. I mean, some of the stuff that I'm hearing young people say, even just here in Los Angeles, where you see these people in their teens and early 20s who are so politically active, and they're engaged in mutual aid, and they're doing all these things in their neighborhoods, and they're really talking about climate change and doing something about it, and they're engaging locally at a way where it's like, yeah, I wasn't doing that in my teens. Like, that's amazing. I was kind of just waking up to, oh, maybe George Bush isn't a great guy in my teens,
Yeah.
And they're miles beyond that.
Yeah.
They would have had to have been very patient with me if they knew me at that age.
Yes.
And it's amazing. I think it's just absolutely amazing.
Totally. I agree. I think I think it's really inspiring to see that. And I think a lot of that has to do with people building these kind of structures outside of the typical schooling structure. Because when I was a kid, it was basically like, you go to school and that's it. And like, I had a little bit of it from my parents because they cared and they were engaged with politics and things like that. But these days I see like, you can't go to a community center or even like a bookstore without there being something there that prods your kids and being like, hey, that thing that you learned in school today, is that really true? I didn't really have that as a kid. And I think this speaks a lot to these structures that people are building outside of schools, whether that be a community center or just like a neighborhood hangout or a bookstore, or, what have you.
And do you see that expanding, like just in the world?
I do. I see I see a lot of these spaces that are questioning very openly and are inviting kids into these spaces. I think that's the other thing that's changing is, this country is very anti-child, on across the spectrum, whether that be not being that phased when kids are shot, or on the opposite side of the spectrum, just like not thinking that they should speak, so like it's really just anti-child. And so communities have had to fill in that space and teach children that they have inherent value as, human beings. And so like Bell Hooks has written a lot about this. And in fact, when I knew that I was pregnant, I immediately went back to one of her books, Will to Change. And I think what's been happening that I didn't see when I was growing up that I see happening now is these spaces being like, no, we are either for children or we're for everyone, including children. So like there's a bookstore here in town, Red Emma's in Baltimore, that is just a beautiful space. And my kid calls it Books and Fun because we go there, we eat food, we read books. And, you know, the people who it's a worker owned co-op, the people who work there are always happy to see him and he feels welcomed. Whereas I feel like when I was a kid and I walked into Borders, like with my mom or something, everyone was always like, oh, a child, you know, like how annoying. And so I feel like there's more spaces, and that's just one example. There are community gardens, like there are, you know, cafes that are more geared towards kids that have little areas where they can explore and paint. And so I think I'm seeing more of that now than when I was growing up. And I really, really like that. And I feel like these spaces are specifically put into place by people with either overtly radical politics or just a politics that they haven't really dissected, but that believes that kids should be included, which automatically means that kids are going to be included in the conversations that adults have about, hey, I can't pay for healthcare, or hey, because the more that the kids are around the adults having these serious conversations where the adults are just living their lives, there's no kids table. It's just like the kids are just hearing all of this, and then they grow up feeling like, oh, well, I'm engaged in this because I'm in it. I'm like the fish in water. And so I think that these spaces are doing a great job and will continue doing a great job radicalizing kids at an early age. And it's all due to the people outside of the official systems that are building these spaces.
I mean, that's absolutely wonderful to hear. And I mean, one thing I've always just kind of noticed, and I don't have kids, but I have become an uncle recently, and like that's kind of changed me. I mean that has, even just on the micro level where, you know, maybe if I'm on a flight and there's a young child near me, I might not have the most pleasant of looks on my face, even if I'm trying to conceal it. And I do try. I mean, you know, you don't want to be rude, but it might just sort of be. But that's like now I'm just not. I'm not that guy anymore. Like now I'm just kind of like. I mean, I don't love a baby screaming. I mean, nobody loves it. Nobody does. but I'm just kind of
is the least happy of anybody on that flight.
Exactly. And I'm also just kind of. Well, this is just how the cycle goes, and this being needs a support system, even if it's just a patient person on a flight. And that's just, you know, that's just kind of my attitude now. And I just kind of roll with it. And I really do want to see those spaces available for kids because there's going to be some challenges. I don't think there's any doubting that.
Well, and I think it's a two-way street, right? Like I want to feel supported by the youth as well, just like I want to support them, you know? And I think that that's what mutual aid is all about. It's this idea of mutualism, right? It's not just like this top down. And that's why I think, you know, we have to look at things like mentorship. Like typically it's been, the older person is mentoring the younger person. Well, there have been several times in the past few years where I've been mentored by people who are far younger than me. And I think that's awesome. And I think it really just speaks to this, like we get stuck in this hierarchical thinking like, oh, I couldn't be taught anything by someone who's younger than me. It's like, but why? That's ridiculous. And so I think that it's really like we should look at it as a two-way street and also recognize that if we want kids to grow up and be healthy adults mentally and physically, which I'm assuming most people do, you have to teach them at a young age that they matter, that they are welcome in spaces, that they're allowed to be seen in public, you know, like that has to be a thing, that's okay. And I think that what's shifting too is people understanding each other's boundaries better. You know, so I was at an event, I was at a party yesterday and my son was there and it just got to the point where he was a little overwhelmed with all the people. Now, here's the thing. I get very overwhelmed by people. I think this is probably one of the reasons I became a performer. I was like, hey, I'll be up over here. I still want to like see people, but like alone on a stage. Yeah. So I started to recognize his own like anxiety. Whereas when I was a kid, people didn't really care. They were like, oh, just, just stop being annoying. Like there's a lot of people. So what? And so I think what's happening now is that if I were just as a 38-year-old saying like, I'm feeling kind of overwhelmed with the people, I'm going to go home. So many of my friends would all be like, oh, that's totally cool. I understand. Whereas like 20 years ago, they'd be like, what? That's lame. Like I feel like we just as human beings are getting a little bit better with respecting people's boundaries and how people feel at certain times, as long as we are able to communicate it. I'm not going to communicate it like a toddler and have a meltdown. But I think that is also helping people recognize that like, oh yeah, the kid is in that same position. They just can't walk up to me and be like, hello, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed by the amount of people in this room. Like, so I think that's also helped, is that I think a lot of people are maturing across the board. Now, of course, it's going the opposite way in a lot of instances, but we must give ourselves the joy for our victories when we can.
So on that, if you had to kind of quantify it, how optimistic are you for just the future of the United States?
Well, so I'll unpack that by unpacking language because I'm a word nerd. To me, optimism is pointless. Because optimism to me is the idea that I'll sit back and something will just happen. I'm optimistic about today's lotto numbers because there's nothing I can do about it, right? To me, hope is far more interesting. And to quote a friend of mine who was unfortunately passed, Clee Benally, the indigenous anarchist, said, I have the kind of hope that burns cop cars. And I think I have a similar kind of hope. It's a very jagged hope. It's rough around the edges and it's a little dangerous, but it's a very active kind of hope. It's the kind of hope where I don't feel like I can just sit back and think that things will get better. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the future of the United States, I would actually be fine with the United States not existing. Mm-hmm. All empires fall. This one's going to fall at some point too. My feeling is I would rather it fall in a way that can be the least violent and the least oppressive. And I think that that's something that we could manifest, we being the people, the children of empire. And I don't think like the United States as an entity isn't important. When people are nationalists, it's like it's a shallow, it's a ridiculous, it's an imposed culture. It's not yours, like the mm-hmm. people of Appalachia have a culture. The people of New Orleans surely have a culture. The people of, the Pacific Northwest and places around Seattle and things like that, in Maine, whatever. But what is American culture? What, that we have sparklers and eat apple pie? Like it's, mm-hmm. To me, the idea of an American culture is part of this fallacy of American exceptionalism. And so to me, there's nothing interesting in really saving that. The borders of the United States, it's all made up. Right. Just as you can see with the Gulf of America. Look how easy it is to just change something. Look how easy. And what if we just said, well, now the border with Mexico is just not there anymore. Like you can just do this because it's not anything that exists in the real world. It's all shit that we've decided, that we've agreed upon matters. And so I think to me, the future of the United States is uninteresting. It's really, to me, the future of the people who call this place sure. home, and the variations of how they do that. And in terms of that, again, depends on the day. Sure. I have the kind of hope that walks with despair. But I do have hope. And again, it's a very, very active hope.
Do you think we'll see the end of the empire in our lifetimes? If you had to do an over under?
I don't know that we'd see the end of empire in the way that I want it to end, which is, the least violent. Sure. I think it's very possible that we see a very violent end of empire. Vis-a-vis like a world war or something like that. I think that's possible that we see that within our lifetimes. But again, I would really hope not. And one of the things that I and others that I work with or build with or whatever the word is, have been grappling with is like, what does it mean to plan and work for the end of an empire that you'll never see? It's kind of like that that phrase, like, wise is the man who plants a tree knowing he'll never enjoy its shade. Like, okay, but that's a heavy thing, because everything that we do is like, okay, I do this and then I get this, return on investment. That's like how we're programmed. So it's a heavy question, but I don't think so. Not in the way that I'd like it to look.
Where can people go to learn more about you?
So all of my stuff, I tried to put it up behind me, but it's like cutting off it's artkillingapathy.com is kind of the hub for all of my stuff. My main gig, I suppose, is Project Censored. I'm the co-host of that radio program, and that's up at projectcensored.org.
Eleanor, thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, Ron. It was fun to sit down and chat with you.
That was Eleanor Goldfield. Check out all of her stuff. Check out Censored if you've never checked that out. They do phenomenal work over there. Music for the 1000 podcast is provided by Andrew Saxonov. Be sure to check out his podcast, Baywatching Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a 5-star review, would you? This is still a very, very new show. Every 5-star review helps. And if you want to support this show on the sustainability end, you can do so over at patreon.com/romplacone. For a give what you can level, you get all kinds of cool perks. You get access to the 1000 episodes before they go out to the public. You get bonus content not available anywhere else. You get a Zoom hangout once a month. We do a Zoom hangout. It's a really cool community. And I'm going to be unrolling something new very, very soon that patrons are going to have access to for a limited time. I'm real excited about that. I'm going to be announcing more about that very, very soon. But for now, 76. We are 76, so punk rock is starting to form. It's actually been a few years since the proto-punk band Death was kicking it in Detroit. And speaking of Detroit, Iggy and the Stooges over in Ann Arbor. And across the pond, Joe Strummer is jamming. Not with the Clash yet, but he's jamming. Well, maybe, I guess maybe he might be with the Clash at that point, 76. I'm not going to Google it. That would be cheating. And, of course, a guy named Malcolm is talking to a guy named John Lydon. All right. Catch you next week. Peace. Hey, guys. Ron Placone here. Take your own 1,000 challenge. No, you don't need to interview 1,000 people, although if you want to do that, go for it. Your 1,000 challenge can be whatever you want. Maybe you want to call a friend out of the blue once a week. Maybe you want to read a book every month. Maybe you want to start a different garden every season. I guess that might be dependent on where you live. Look, the point of the challenge is taking on an endeavor that enriches your life in some way, and it can be measured. And then, of course, you do it regularly. That's what 1,000 is doing for me, and hopefully for you too. The main reason for this podcast and every podcast I've ever done is to build community. So take your own challenge. Then join our Facebook group. It's called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? ? That's 1,000 What's Your Challenge ? And post about what your 1,000 challenge is and the progress you're making. All I ask is that people be encouraging of each other's challenges. This is personal and vulnerable, so be cool. There's enough negativity on social media. We don't need to add to it. For those of you who aren't on Facebook, hopefully in the future we'll be expanding to places like Discord, Reddit, but for now, we're starting on Facebook. And again, that Facebook group is called 1,000 What's Your Challenge? See you there.